On a day when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi once again publicly tried to steer the House of Representatives away from impeachment, the president ended the day with an historic decision that may now be speeding him toward impeachment. The president announced in an interview tonight with the Washington Post that he will try to block any of his current or former staff from testifying to any congressional committees about the contents of the Mueller report or any other form of investigation of the president. Donald Trump is trying to turn the presidential clock back to the early spring of 1973, when President Richard Nixon found it inconceivable that his staff would testify to the special Senate committee investigating the Watergate scandal. When the Watergate Committee first considered calling White House counsel John Dean as a witness in the investigation of President Nixon, the president said that that was impossible because of executive privilege. President Nixon said, well, because it is executive privilege. I mean, you can't, of course, no president could ever agree to allow the counsel to the president to go down and testify before a committee. But because of pressure from Democratic and, very importantly, principled Republican members of the committee, President Nixon eventually surrendered to that pressure on May 22nd, 1973. Christopher Lydon reported in the New York Times on a new written statement that day by President Nixon offering his surrender on executive privilege. A single sentence near the end of his long statement today marked the decline of the controversial doctrine in Mr. Nixon's recent interpretations of it. Executive privilege, the president declared, will not be invoked as to any testimony concerning possible criminal conduct or discussions of possible criminal conduct in the matters presently under investigation, including the Watergate affair and the alleged cover-up. Hillary Clinton, who went to work as a staff member of one of the committees investigating President Nixon, remembered that this way today.
The witnesses in 1974 and 73 and 74 were predominantly administration witnesses. They were John Dean, who happened to be White House counsel. So it's fully appropriate for this Congress to call Don McGahn, who happened to be White House counsel.
Don McGahn was subpoenaed by the House Judiciary Committee yesterday, and that will apparently be the first witness subpoena that the Trump White House will fight in the House Judiciary Committee's hearings about the Mueller report. In an interview with the Washington Post tonight, President Trump said, quote, "There is no reason to go any further, and especially in Congress where it's very partisan, obviously very partisan." Richard Benveniste, a former Watergate prosecutor, told the Washington Post, "It seems to me executive privilege was waived when McGahn was permitted to give testimony and to be interviewed by special counsel Mueller. I don't see how the White House can assert executive privilege with something that has already been revealed." Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, issued a statement saying this: "As such, the moment for the White House to assert some privilege to prevent this testimony from being heard has long since passed." A source close to former White House counsel Don McGahn told the Washington Post this: "He's not eager to testify. He's not reluctant. He got a subpoena. It compels him to testify. But there are some countervailing legal reasons that might prevent that," said one person close to McGahn, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private discussions. "He doesn't want to be in contempt of Congress, nor does he want to be in contempt of his ethical obligations and legal obligations as a former White House official." Also tonight, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin delivered a written response to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Richard Neal, about Chairman Neal's demand that the Internal Revenue Service deliver 6 years of Donald Trump's tax returns to him. The law very specifically and clearly allows the chairman of the tax writing committees in the House and the Senate to see any tax returns they choose to see. The law puts no limitation on their rights to examine tax returns. This law has never been challenged or defied by the IRS or the Treasury Department in its nearly 100-year history. Secretary Mnuchin said that the administration is still reviewing the demand for the tax returns and that the Justice Department is now researching the legal issues involved, but that they will have a final official response to Chairman Neal on May 6th. Leading off our discussion tonight is a member of the House Judiciary Committee, Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He is also a candidate for president in the Democratic primaries. Also joining our discussion, John Heilemann, national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He is co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. And Jennifer Palmieri, former White House communications director for President Obama and former communications director for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, is also joining us tonight. Great to have you all here. And Congressman Swalwell, I want to start with you. I've had a member of the Judiciary Committee, at least one, on every night since the Mueller report came out, because it seemed so obvious as soon as we had it in our hands that Robert Mueller was basically delivering this to you on the Judiciary Committee, as special prosecutors have in the past. He clearly has passages in there where he contemplates impeachment, contemplates your committee considering impeachment. And here we are tonight with the President of the United States saying, in effect, there will be absolutely no cooperation with any subpoena you send involving any aspect of the Mueller report.
We have a lawless president right now. The law and order doesn't mean anything to him, and he's banking on the American people not caring. They care. That's why they gave us the majority back in November, was to end, these abuses of power, put a balance of power on them. So to people like Don McGahn and the individual today who ignored our subpoena, who oversees security clearances, and others who may be subpoenaed, I tell them, why don't you obey the Constitution and just come in and testify and disobey a lawless president? That's doing the right thing. I don't give Don McGahn points for telling the truth under oath. I mean, is that the standard now? I would give him points if he disobeyed the president and those countervailing legal principles, or whatever he wants to call it, and come before Congress and lay out the number of times the president disobeyed the law. We're going to hear all of this eventually. We're on a road to impeachment. It's not a road that any of us asked for. And I think the first waypoint is going to be to hear from these crucial witnesses, starting with Bob Mueller.
Nancy Pelosi clearly didn't think you were on a road to impeachment earlier this afternoon. This is before Donald Trump made this move tonight. What Donald Trump has done tonight changes whatever Speaker Pelosi might have to say about this tomorrow. This is one of those things where you can't be in control of what happens next year because of this president.
Again, it's something none of us have asked for. And the way I look at it, look, there are a number of different ways to protect against an abusive president. First, the voters. If the voters elect someone and they're abusing the law, then you have the checks and balances. The voters gave that. We're exhausting the remedies. We're trying oversight. We're trying the power of the purse. He shut down the government. He's refusing to use to honor subpoenas. So where does that leave us? The only other remedy is to impeach him and suggest removal to the Senate. And that's where he's taking us right now, not by choice, but just by the way that he's acting. Lawrence, I have a 2-year-old. I count to 3 and I take away the toys when he misbehaves. I know if I don't do that, he's going to get worse. We have an awful kid in the White House. If we don't count to 3 and start holding him accountable, it's just going to get worse.
Jennifer Palmieri, you worked in a White House. You worked in the presidential campaign that was victimized and attacked by the Russians, successfully attacked by the Russians in support of the other candidate. Your reaction to what you're hearing tonight from a president saying there will be absolutely no cooperation with any of the subpoenas being issued by the Judiciary Committee. The president doesn't want any of the witnesses to show up.
The thing that surprised me about the president's, the interview that he did with the Washington Post, he did with Bob Costa, is that he felt the need to justify why he wasn't going to allow anyone to show up. Normally, and that suggests to me that they might be a little unnerved in the White House. Normally, he would just say, Russian hoax, it's a witch hunt, I'm not going to cooperate. But he felt the need to say, we already did cooperate. I had these people already speak to Mueller. They don't need to go to Congress, too. And if you look at the scale of the people who are being called up to Congress, it's a lot of people that are not necessarily under his control anymore, right? Don McGahn, you see Mnuchin wrestling with whether or not he's going to give his taxes. I thought it was interesting that Mnuchin didn't just shut that down, but said, I'm going to come back to you in a couple of weeks with another answer. You have Klein, Mr. Klein, who is the individual that used to approve the security clearances. He's refused to show up. But there are a lot of pots involving the president's legal standing that are starting to boil over, and it suggests to me, the way the president's handling it, that he's feeling a little unnerved, as he should.
John, is this a run-out-the-clock strategy? Is this, they want my tax returns, the law clearly allows them to have my tax returns, let's come up with some kind of legal reply that says we're not giving you the tax returns, which then forces Chairman Neal into court, which takes, we don't know, a year and a half, takes us up to the next presidential election. Is that what he's doing with the Judiciary Committee? No witnesses, fight through every subpoena in court all the way to the Supreme Court to get each witness that you want so that he can run out the clock in a presidential campaign.
I think it's sort of cute and quaint to suggest that there is a strategy in play here, Lawrence.
As opposed to chaos, you mean?
Well, as opposed to just panic and fear over more disclosure, what will happen if more of the truth comes out. I think the strategy, that may be what they think they're doing. What it seems to me that is actually the net effect of this as a political matter is they are inviting impeachment. They are begging for impeachment. They are making impeachment much more likely. Your point a second ago, Nancy Pelosi and House leadership did not want to pursue impeachment. To a large extent, large parts of Congressman Swalwell's caucus still doesn't want to pursue impeachment. But the president, by pushing, by not just having obstructed justice already on the plain meaning of what obstruction is, as laid out in the Mueller report, he's still obstructing justice by trying to say no because Congress is partisan, which is what he says to Costa. He says they're partisan, so I can't cooperate with them. By defying the subpoenas, by provoking this constitutional clash, by doing the things he's doing, he is making it impossible for Democrats not to impeach him. Whereas if he had played this smart over the course of the last few days, he was aligned with Nancy Pelosi. Neither wanted impeachment. Now he's making it more likely with every move that he's making.
What about that, Congressman? Is the president's decision tonight in effect, forcing your committee to consider impeachment in a quicker timetable than you might have?
I think it shows a complete disrespect for the law, and that he's not going to follow the law, and we're going to have to enforce it. We're going to have to hold in contempt the people who refuse to come forward. And I don't think people want that for their reputation. They should just do the right thing and come forward. And again, if you take a step back, if this was just about Russia and the lies he told to cover up Russia, maybe you could say, well, naive campaign, didn't understand what they were getting into. He was trying to protect himself. I don't buy that, but maybe you could say that. But we've got the emoluments clause still outstanding. That's going to court. We've got him telling the commissioner for Border Patrol, hey, violate the law and I'll pardon you if you get in trouble. I mean, there are so many other outstanding issues that we just have to do something. Doing nothing is not an option with this guy.
Jennifer Palmieri, Jerry Nadler has some subpoenas that he wants respected both by the witnesses and the courts. Might he decide that in order to add weight to those subpoenas in court, in any court fight over them, he simply changes the title of what the hearing was going to be to an impeachment inquiry?
I guess that's an option that's available to him. I think that everybody's right that that Trump's poured accelerant on the fire, and that could lead to impeachment. But I still think we have courts to weigh in. You got a long way to go before you're actually at that point. And I don't know that it needs to be at odds with what Speaker Pelosi has said. I think, what she said is Congress has to uphold its constitutional responsibility. It's got to hold the president accountable. It's got to, and it has to pick up the Mueller report and hold hearings on it and follow that where it leads. It just may lead to this, an impeachment outcome, a little sooner than it could have if, as John points out, Trump was smarter about it.
Jennifer, I have to ask you, as a veteran of a presidential campaign, we see the presidential candidates responding to the impeachment question differently. Elizabeth Warren was out there right away after reading the Mueller report saying, yes, you have to go to it. It's a matter of principle. You don't have a choice. There's a variety of responses we now have. What would you advise a presidential candidate, if you were working on a presidential campaign now on the Democratic side, to handle the question of impeachment?
I think it's such a serious matter that I think how everyone should handle it is to say that Congress needs to follow its constitutional responsibilities and pick up the Mueller report, hold hearings on it, and follow that path wherever it legitimately leads, putting aside any political concerns and partisan concerns. And if that leads you to impeachment, then so be it. And if it leads you to suggest that that's not in order, then so be it. But it is, we have a president that doesn't abide by rules of the Constitution, and it's really important that Congress in this moment, whether it's politically popular or politically expedient or not, do that. And that's how I think presidential candidates should also answer that question.
John, you've always been of the school that Donald Trump is his own worst enemy. Is that what we're seeing tonight? Because we've seen, and I completely understand Nancy Pelosi's political strategy on impeachment, both last year when she didn't want it to be part of the House races in which she won the House of Representatives, and how much she has not wanted it to get in the way of Democratic Party politics this year, how she would rather have a wounded Donald Trump on the presidential ballot when the general election comes. I get all of that. Yeah. Donald Trump seems unable to see what Nancy Pelosi was in effect trying to do, trying to get the Democrats past this. And he seems to be crashing right into the impeachment process.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's interesting that, we have noted many times that Trump seems to respect Pelosi, and he seems to get that she is a master tactician and strategist. And yet, in this instance, even though he knows that and has acknowledged it in various ways, he does not seem in this moment, a crucial moment, where it was not that hard to figure out what she wanted to do and how she wanted to let this thing play out. He did not seem to be able to figure out whether that's because he doesn't have enough people around him advising him, or he is just blind to it, or more, I think, likely, blinded by his rage, the rage that we've seen come out, the extraordinary thing of we've witnessed with him on Twitter over the last few days, where the ridiculousness of all of his aides going out on the air over the weekend saying he's never been happier, and then all of his public behavior betraying the fact that he is still filled with anger, filled with panic, filled with fear. Everything he's doing suggests that at this moment, to the extent that he ever has operational political faculties, they are now totally out of whack. And he is, I think, as I say, by provoking her, by provoking the Congress, by continuing to behave in ways that no sensible majority party in Congress can tolerate, he is, again, forcing Democrats to do that which I think many Democrats would prefer not to do.
It's almost like when Johnson lost Cronkite, right? Trump, he doesn't want to lose Pelosi. I mean, she's actually been giving him the benefit of the doubt. Do the right thing, follow the law, cooperate. We don't want to do this.
Report, which was never necessary, which is not what the Democrats did with Nixon. And now her new call was to wait for the unredacted Mueller report, which also functions as a delay tactic for Donald Trump, which he couldn't accept.
Yeah, you don't want to lose Speaker Pelosi on this. She's given him every opportunity to cooperate, and now he's pushing her and I think the Congress into a position where there's no other option.
We're going to have to take a break here.
Speaker Pelosi is pretty smart. I think Speaker Pelosi is pretty smart. I think she understood when she laid out her ground rules that Donald Trump was likely to ignore them and lead himself to the spot that he finds himself in now. So I'm not sure that she is taken by surprise by this, or didn't understand that from the get-go when those words first came out of her mouth. She knows what she's doing.
That is a really great point, Jennifer, and I had not thought of that. But yes, if this is a rope-a-dope, Nancy Pelosi has quite a dope that she's been roping into this. Congressman Eric Swalwell, John Heilman, Jennifer Palmieri.
Okay, that was good. That was very strong. Very strong.
For joining us. That was not written. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.